1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 10 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. As always, regardless of whether you are watching this on YouTube or listening to this on the OWS podcast feed, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with a week that is very unique against what we have had most weeks this season. So one of my favorite parts of the week is I very much do everything in a bubble up until late Thursday, sometimes mid Thursday, but throughout Monday, Tuesday, I'm often opening up the slate, getting some initial thoughts on it. Wednesday, Thursday, I start really pulling in my research. Thursday, I'm writing up my DFS interpretations, building out my initial player pool. And then I get to this point where I leave the bubble and I come out and look at initial ownership projections. And a lot of weeks, I am pleasantly surprised by the players who are projecting for high ownership. The reason for that is obviously we prefer lower owned players on our own list in order to win tournaments. And as we've talked about in the past, the best way to be contrarian is typically to think for yourself. In other words, it's not to say, how can I be different from what the field is doing? But instead it's to say, what am I seeing? What do I like? And then ideally you come out of that bubble and compare it to what the field is seeing, what the field likes. And you realize, oh, I am already being different. I can play the plays that I like or put things together the way that I want to put things together and be different from the field. So why is that? Well, because the field tends to gravitate towards safety. So oftentimes that means that because the ownership is driven by projection systems and is driven by content providers who are also talking about kind of who the safer plays are on the slate, who the plays are on the slate that they can project for strong performances. Because of that, those end up being the plays that tend to draw the most ownership. But the safe plays, and this isn't always the case, but oftentimes the guys who have a higher floor, and it's just the nature of how DraftKings handles pricing, the guys who have a higher floor in a particular price range tend to have fewer paths to a ceiling game than other players in that same price range. And so if the field is gravitating toward the safer plays, and we are instead thinking about what is required to win a tournament on this particular week, that allows us to often come out of that bubble and see, oh, the field is really expressing way too much confidence and certainty in these lower ceiling plays, these safe, comfortable, lower ceiling plays. And so we're able to be contrarian just by taking our favorite plays. And then on top of that, typically the way that the field is going to play those players is going to be wrong. So take Drake London, for example, or Keenan Allen in the past, where we're recognizing on our end that in order for that player, just because of their there's nothing against who they are as a player. It's not saying they're not a good player. I mean, these are tremendous players. It's that Keenan Allen in particular, one of the best route runners in the NFL over the last decade and a half, and yet I would always preach against playing him up until last year, his final year in LA, where they just completely leaned on him week in and week out. But it was because he was a player with the profile that he had. Drake London is the same way, that they need volume in order to hit outside of just fluky outcomes. Now, if a player is 1%, 2% owned, is there some value in betting on fluky outcomes? Absolutely, because if you can get, especially depending on the price range, depending on what else the week provides, there's a lot that goes into that. Obviously, actually, let me touch on this real quickly. This is kind of more winner circle type content than Angles podcast content. Winner circle is our midweek slate, or not slate, but DFS macro theory and training podcast. But if it's a week where let's say it's a week where there's lots of guys in the 5K price range at wide receiver who project really well and have high ceiling. Well, on a week like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to take a swing on a different wide receiver in the 5K price range who you're just sort of hoping for a fluky outcome, because we think about what the other rosters in the field will look like, what you're going to be competing against for first place. So if there are 4 or 5 guys in this price range that all project well, all have high ceilings, chances are pretty good that 1 or 2 of those guys are going to hit. And then chances are pretty good that one or two guys who hit are on a decent number of rosters. And so even if you get your fluky outcome correct, well, now you're still just kind of scoring the same thing that these all 20% of the field is scoring from these other more projectable guys. On the flip side, there are times where we want to swing on fluky outcomes because maybe what the field is expressing certainty in is guys who aren't really that high upside, or even don't have that high of a chance of hitting the score that people think they're going to hit. And so we can kind of embrace that sort of variance a little bit more. But generally speaking, Drake London, unless it's a high volume game, he is not going to see a monster DFS score. And yet he's typically rostered at a really high rate, right? And so playing him correctly would be saying, if I'm playing Drake London, that means, unless I'm just hoping something fluky happens at high ownership, which is not a sharp way to play DFS, that means me putting Drake London on this roster is effectively saying, I expect the Falcons to have to throw the ball a lot in this game. So then we should be asking ourselves, what other questions or what other plays are we getting right as a result of getting Drake London right here? If Drake London is hitting because the Falcons are throwing the ball a bunch, then what else does that mean? Who else should we be considering from the Falcons or from this game environment? And so oftentimes we also see these high-owned players who not only is the field typically embracing a little bit more safety in the way that they're kind of allocating the top end of their ownership as a collective unit, as a field. But on top of that, when they're playing these guys, they're often playing them incorrectly. And so a lot of times I come out of my bubble and I look at ownership and it's like a celebration moment where it's like, wow, like all I have to do this week is play the plays that I like, or in the places where the plays I like do match up with the higher owned plays, I can say, or just play them the right way. And that's also going to outmaneuver the field. So that's a lot of weeks. And especially this year, I've had a lot of weeks like that. And then we have weeks like this. And this is a unique week. This is a rare week. If you're new here, this is sort of the idea of the Angles podcast is my player grid in the scroll on 1 week season is going to have my player pool for the week. So we'll get deeper into individual players I like on that spot. But DFS is a strategy game. DFS is a unique puzzle that we put together each week. And so the idea behind the Angles podcast is ideally, ultimately, to kind of give you the box to that puzzle. So you can see the picture on the box, have an understanding of what's unique about this particular week, what's unique about the puzzle we are putting together this week, and give you a clearer pathway to outmaneuvering the field toward a first place finish. Again, thinking about those first place finishes, thinking strategically about those first place finishes, how we get there, because that's where most of the money is. That's how we make money in DFS, is knocking out some of those first place finishes throughout the season or throughout a stretch of seasons, depending on what types of contests we are playing and what our chances are of winning, whether it's one entry out of 2,000 or whether it's one entry out of 500 or one entry out of 100 or whatever, depends on or dictates how frequently you'll hit those top end outcomes. But again, as we see at OWS all the time, we should be hitting those top end outcomes. If you're playing a single entry, 100 entry tournament, you're probably going to finish first place in that contest more often than once every 100 times you play it. You're probably going to finish, depending how well you're playing, once every 80 times you play it, once every 65 times you play it, maybe even once every 45, 50 times you play it. And so it's about positioning ourselves for those types of outcomes, obviously. By the way, I got 3 hours of sleep last night, so I think I'm doing well right now in terms of following my thought trails. There's a slight fear in the back of my mind in a solo podcast on video with no pausing that there's going to be a point where I lose the thread of whatever I'm talking about. And if that happens, then we'll see what I do from there. But okay, so back to my notes. There's other weeks like this week where I come out of my bubble, I have my list, and this is what happened yesterday, Thursday. I had my list of, okay, done all my research. Here's my player pool. I don't love it. I don't love any of these guys. Okay, now let's look at ownership and let's see what I might be missing. Maybe the field has something that they're expressing confidence in that I'm kind of overlooking or that will spark some new thoughts or whatever it might be, right? So I've got this pool that I'm not super enthusiastic about, and I come out and my pool almost exactly mirrors the highest projected owned players at every single position. Okay, so on the one hand, that if you're trying to be contrarian, if you're trying to be different, okay, I cannot be contrarian just by quote thinking for myself this week. This is a week where I have to say, where can I be contrarian? What might happen on this slate? These what if questions where you can say, what if this game plays out this particular way? What if this offense does this? What if this spot that everybody's overlooking ends up producing in a totally different way than everybody is thinking? And if this were a week where I came, and I have weeks like this as well. I don't think I've had one like this year, but I had a handful last year where I come out of my research, I have my pool, and I'm actually enthusiastic about the pool. I'm like, man, I really like these plays. And then I come out and I look at ownership, and these plays I really like are the highest projected owned plays on the slate. I don't love those types of weekends. We have to figure out how to work with every weekend that is presented to us in DFS. But on those weekends, those are the weekends where I have to say, man, I have to do something differently. And I have to actually kind of move away from what I feel are clearly the sharpest plays in order to do something differently. And you kind of find that balance of like, how can I finish in first place while still playing these plays I really like? Maybe there's these two guys in the 8K price range that I really like, that the field really likes, but the field probably won't be playing them together, right? Maybe I can play the players I really like, but just put them together in a different way than the field so that the combinatorial ownership is low on these players, on these pairings. Maybe that's my pathway to a first place finish, right? And those weeks get a little bit tricky. But then we have weeks like this where my pool, it was like, I looked at ownership saying, God, I hope there's something that is high owned that I'm just not seeing, because then I can find something that I feel maybe I can look a little deeper into it and feel a little bit more enthusiastic instead of coming out and saying, yeah, I'm really not that excited about my player pool. Let's look at ownership. Oh, my player pool is the highest projected owned players on the slate. So what that shows me is this is the week where, and a good way to just illustrate this is to say, let's say that one guy, let's take two wide receivers, both priced at 6K. And wide receiver A is going to be 30% owned, 20% owned. Let's say 20% owned. Wide receiver B is going to be 3% owned. Wide receiver A projects better than wide receiver B. Therefore, yeah, of course, he's higher owned, right? But if we really look at it, a lot of times, especially on a week like this where nothing's really standing out, that player A is only going to be projected to outscore player B 55% of the time. So in other words, we play out the slate 100 times, 55 times player A outscores player B. But 45 times player B outscores player A, and yet there's this massive gap in ownership between the two players. So the expected value tilts you toward player B, the guy who's going to be lower owned. Yes, he's a slight underdog to player A, but if we played out the slate 100 times, he's going to outscore player A a pretty decent number of times, and the ownership is going to be way lower. So what you win when you win, what you win when you get things right is going to be much greater. So this is a week that tilts me toward that type of thinking, where I want to look and say, okay, yes, the top plays on paper, the top plays through my research line up with the top projected owned plays, but also I don't feel super confident in any of these plays. I wasn't enthusiastic, or almost any of these plays. I wasn't enthusiastic about almost any of these plays. So isn't there an opportunity this week to think outside the box, to ask what if questions? So this is a week where I am going to be looking, and I mentioned this in the DFS interpretation, I mentioned this in the player grid. I would recommend, if you're an OWS user and you kind of like to be up to date on my thoughts and just kind of use me as a sounding board for how you're seeing the slate, I would recommend definitely prioritizing coming back and checking the Sunday morning update. So I'm on the West Coast. I usually post that before I go to bed, which is about 2 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m. on the West Coast on Saturday night, heading into Sunday morning. So that's but 4 or 5 a.m. Eastern time, that's usually posted. If you're on the East Coast, that gives you plenty of time in the morning. If you're on the West Coast, you probably wake up a little bit early to start your DFS prep in the mornings anyway. So that gives you some time to see my thoughts. But my point being, I would expect, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm doing my research, I'm looking through the slate, and I usually have 90 to 95% of my player pool finished on Thursday night through the lens of what makes the most sense to me in my research. And then I see, hey, a lot of the guys who make the most sense to me aren't even drawing that much attention from the field, or the field is going to play these guys the wrong way, or whatever it is, right? My edge is just playing the guys I like in a sharp way, on sharp rosters, on rosters that tell a story, on rosters that create leverage, on rosters that clear out a path to a first place finish. And that's enough, right? Whereas this is a week where I can't just play things based on strictly on my pool. And I have to be willing to go off the board a little bit. And so that's going to be my Friday night, my Saturday afternoon, my Saturday night, is really trying to think outside the box and trying to see if I can isolate some spots where the floor is low, but the ceiling is there for this play to play out in a particular way, to where, whether it's a stack or a game environment or an individual player, that it can jump over this ownership that, to me, yes, the ownership, the heavy ownership this week is on the best on paper plays on the slate. But if we could put these same plays on a different slate, a slate where there's a lot to like, these guys would get pushed way down the ownership list. In other words, they're not typical most popular plays on the slate. They don't have the same floor ceiling range as a typical most popular play on the slate. So I want to be aware of that, and I want to be willing to think outside the box and see what else I come up with. So the player grid that will go out today is that there's a little bit of the outside the box stuff. And then there's also the, and I don't want to put too much pressure on myself to I don't want to force myself to go outside the box inorganically. And so, maybe the Sunday morning update won't have a ton different than what I'm going to have in there, as things are released. But my expectation is that there will be a few things, 2, 3, 4 things in my player pool that the research isn't really pointing toward. And that's not even to say that those are the best plays among all the things that the research isn't pointing toward, but that can just give you some additional ideas. And I want to encourage you on your end to recognize this as that type of week and say, okay, here's what the research is pointing me toward. Here's what I'm picking up, but also I don't have that much confidence. And these guys are going to be high owned. And I'm not playing to cash. I'm okay doing something differently than the field and finishing outside the money, if that thing I'm doing differently than the field gives me a path to a first place finish. And so be willing to think outside the box this week, to embrace some risk this week. And okay, so I want to look to kind of highlight some of these, like why I'm seeing things the way I'm seeing them. I want to look at a couple things. So first, we're going to look at the wide receiver situations of every team on the slate as examples of why nothing is really standing out to me. Then we're going to touch on some plays that are drawing ownership at quarterback, at running back, at wide receiver, and at tight end, just to give us an opportunity to kind of poke holes in these plays. And again, these are the plays that were making my list from my initial research, but why am I not super confident in these plays? I want to touch on some of those things and kind of just give us a clearer understanding of how the field is seeing the slate, how ownership is congregating, but how we might want to look for ways to outmaneuver the field on plays that might not be as high confidence as the ownership would imply. And then we'll touch on some lower owned plays and ways that those plays could end up emerging as valuable pieces on the slate. We'll wrap things up as always with the bottom up build with a 44K salary cap, and then get us out of here. So wide receiver situations as examples of why nothing is really standing out. And we're just going to go through every team. So it's kind of game by game, but I'm going to isolate 15 wide receiver situations that just, like, you can poke heavy holes in these 15 wide receiver situations. And then we'll have 5 where it's like, you can kind of paint the picture on these ones. Okay, so New England is playing the Chicago defense that obviously is really good against the pass and not so great against the run. Our chances of getting tournament winning scores from New England are not particularly high. Chicago in that same game against New England, we've explored this, right? In order to get a tournament winning score from a wide receiver, you're almost always going to need really heavy volume or a really high scoring game. Now, the really heavy volume often comes in really high scoring games, but you're typically going to need really heavy volume and or really high scoring games. Well, Patriots on the road against this Bears defense. Yes, they've looked better with Drake May under center, but he still doesn't have weapons. He still doesn't have an offensive line. The Bears lost Andrew Billings at defensive tackle. They should be getting Montez Sweat back. So their pass rush is getting better. They're getting Jaquan Brisker back in the secondary. And so their pass defense is getting better. Their pass rush is getting better. Their secondary is getting healthier. And then their run defense is weakening. And that's already the way to attack the Bears is on the ground. So the chances of the Patriots putting up a bunch of points and forcing Caleb Williams into a heavy target in a heavy volume game are pretty low. So then you're just saying, okay, hopefully on low volume, I get a big score from Rome Odunze or DJ Moore. Now, those are two guys who, in this vein of thinking outside the box and targeting ceiling, even though we have to embrace volatility, embrace low floors, those are two guys who fall in that bucket. Both those guys are capable of scoring, putting up big games on lower volume. Obviously, you're kind of looking for a fluky outcome in that scenario, but those are guys who can be considered from that in that regard. But in terms of like isolating plays that really stand out on paper, no, like you're not expected to see the Bears have to throw the ball a bunch in this spot. We'll probably get another 26, 28, 29 pass attempt game from Caleb Williams. So the chances of a blow-up game from his pass catchers are pretty low. Indianapolis against Buffalo. So there's going to be a lot of interest on Josh Downs. We'll hit on him in the player grid this week, today. But this is a spot where the Bills defense is really good. And if you've just had a general rule in Sean McDermott's entire era in Buffalo of just don't ever play wide receivers against Buffalo, you would come out significantly ahead over time. This is just not a defense that you typically want to pick on with wide receivers. They're not typically going to give up tournament winning production to wide receivers. Then we have Minnesota. Minnesota is taking on Jacksonville, a Jacksonville team that is expected to be without Trevor Lawrence. So you got Mac Jones under center. They don't have Christian Kirk. And so you have Mac Jones against this scary, confusing Minnesota defense, missing kind of his best safety blanket type weapon. So what are the chances that Minnesota, for the first time all year, is forced to really air it out and have heavy passing volume. So can Justin Jefferson hit unlimited volume? Yes. Can Sam Darnold go for 18 to 22 DraftKings points? Yes. But what are the chances of this being the spot where Sam Darnold goes for 28, 29, this being the spot where Justin Jefferson finally sees enough volume to go for 33, 38 points without just something fluky happening, right? The chances are pretty low that ends up being the case. On the other side of that game, you have Jacksonville, who, again, Mac Jones against this Minnesota defense. So there are pathways to someone like Parker Washington or even Brian Thomas Jr. putting up a big score, but again, recognizing that this is not a good spot on paper. Denver, Kansas City playing each other, these two really good pass defenses, these two really good defenses. What are the chances of this becoming a game where there's tons of volume concentrating on one player and or where tons of points are piling up? Probably not all that high. Atlanta, we've talked about Atlanta all year. If they are in control of a game, the passing volume is going to be somewhat low. They're going to play through the ground game and build everything off of that. They're playing this really bad New Orleans run defense, and New Orleans is missing Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed. They're playing with Mason Tipton and Cedric Wilson as their wide receivers, and so the chances, and they just fired their head coach, right? The chances of New Orleans scoring enough points quickly enough to force Atlanta into a more aggressive game plan, pretty low, right? So those are your dents in the Atlanta wide receivers. New Orleans on the other side. New Orleans is interesting, right? Because we would love it if we could just say, well, they don't have Olave, they don't have Shaheed. Let's play Cedric Wilson. Let's play Mason Tipton. That is certainly viable on this particular week, on this week where there's a lot that's like, yeah, it's viable, right? And that's how we have to kind of think about this week. So you can certainly make a case for those guys, but what's likeliest to happen, what we look at on paper is, and that's kind of, again, what we're exploring here is why things are not really standing out on paper, is that New Orleans is going to play they basically, even without Sean Payton, even without Pete Carmichael, they're still kind of a chess piece offense. And so what I mean by that is when they're missing alpha pieces, they don't typically plug in a different guy as the new alpha piece in that role. Instead, they figure out, okay, how can we use these guys as chess pieces and do unique things with the players, our versatile players who have unique talents on our team, and march the field, right? And so this is a spot where you probably don't see heavy target volume concentrating on individual New Orleans wide receivers. Then we have Washington, who is playing the Steelers, good defense, and Washington, Jaden Daniels, Austin Eckler, Brian Robinson, Terry McLaurin, Noah Brown, Zach Ertz. Those six guys, the core of the offense. Not one of them, halfway through the season, not a single one of them has posted a 4x score against their week 10 salaries. So can you create a case for playing one of these guys, for playing a stack of this game? Absolutely. But on paper, is this a place that we're pushed toward? No, not really. Tennessee, they get Will Levis back. They're playing this really good Chargers defense. The Chargers on the other side of that game, we know that they like to run the ball. B, we know that they've been more willing. There was those couple of games where they had to throw a bunch because of the game environment. And in the two games since then, they have let Justin Herbert throw the ball. So 27 times, 32 times. But, those were in games that the Chargers controlled. The Chargers probably controlled this game against Tennessee. So this is a spot where I feel somewhat confident that we are going to see kind of Herbert pushing up into that high 20s, low 30s for pass attempts. But what are the chances of him throwing it 38 times, 39 times, where you really have that opportunity for a huge score from him, for a tournament winning score from him, a tournament winning score from his pass catchers? What are the chances of that? Pretty low, because Tennessee's probably not going to do well enough on their side of the ball to force that. And so you kind of see how like all these game environments are just setting up in weird ways to where really nothing is standing out. Nothing's jumping off the page in any major sort of way. The Cardinals are, not typically producing tournament winners, and then they're playing against the Jets defense. So just not a spot where you can express a high level of confidence that we're going to see the Cardinals producing huge scores. Eagles, Jalen Hurts, this is off the top of the head, but I think this is right. In 4 games since the bye, his pass attempt totals have been 25, 24, 20, and 14 or 15. I believe those were his pass attempt numbers, all 25 and fewer pass attempts since the Eagles came out of the bye. The Cowboys, we talked about this last week, right? That we talked about the Cowboys. I think last week they were 24th in offensive DVOA, maybe 22nd in offensive DVOA. And we talked last week about, the field is going to look at this spot and just be like, man, Cowboys against the Falcons, and the Falcons have had these high scoring games. And this is the spot, right? No pass rush. So the Cowboys are finally going to do really well. And I kind of, threw up some roadblocks and said, at least keep in mind the fact that the Cowboys have been a genuinely bad offense this year. I mentioned Brady's last year with the Bucs, where it was like all year we kept waiting around for things to finally click. Things still looked good. There was no reason why we could see why the Bucs were consistently underperforming, but eventually you got to a point where you just had to say, this is the Bucs this year, right? And so what I said last week was, this game against the Falcons was a spot where you could give the Cowboys one last chance if you wanted, because of the lack of pass rush, because of the way that the Falcons play defense. But it was like, if they don't look like the old Cowboys in this spot, it's probably time to jump off before everybody else. Now, this week, we have Dak Prescott gone and Cooper Rush coming in. So this is an offense that ranks 25th in offensive DVOA, having had Dak Prescott under center all season. And now they replaced Dak Prescott with Cooper Rush. So yes, Cooper Rush looked good when he had to fill in for Dak, what was that, last year, 2 years ago. But this is also a very different Cowboys offense than when Cooper Rush last stepped in. This is a Cowboys offense that has been like legitimately not good. The Eagles have been really good on defense with Vic Fangio of late, as they've kind of understood his scheme. And so what are the chances of the Cowboys, who have bottom 2 rush defense in the NFL, taking on Saquon Barkley and this Eagles team that has enjoyed running the ball? What are the chances that the Eagles throw the ball 30 times in this spot, right? Probably pretty low, because it's probably a pretty low chance that the Cowboys jump out to a big lead and force the Eagles out of the game plan that they've been leaning into of late, the game plan that's been effective for them of late. And so A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, you're probably looking at, hey, cross your fingers, hopefully they can have a monster game on 6, 7, 8 targets, something like that. So again, another wide receiver set, another offense where it's like, nothing really stands out on paper. Then you have the Cowboys, who are, again, Cooper Rush under center. The price tags have not been lowered for no Dak Prescott, and then a matchup against an Eagles team that has played well on defense. This Cowboys offense has been legitimately bad this season. And so again, another spot where nothing really stands out on paper. And then even the spots that we left alone, right? Are they that exciting, right? Buffalo can hit in this spot against Indianapolis. The matchup is not a problem. The only problem is, how does Buffalo go about winning this game? And if they go about winning this game in a more conservative manner, leaning on James Cook, leaning on Ray Davis, then we have this opportunity for Josh Allen, the pass catchers, to not hit. At the same time, if the Colts are able to do well enough in this spot, or if the Bills just allow Josh Allen to cook, or if we don't get a lot of 30-point scores on this slate, and Josh Allen ends up putting up, and if we don't get many quarterbacks, if any, going over 22, and Josh Allen just puts up 28, 29, just in a typical, 28 pass attempt game, then this Buffalo team could end up being interesting. Pass catchers from this offense could end up being interesting. Pittsburgh, we'll save kind of the deeper dive into this for the player grid, but yeah, Pittsburgh has actually been really interesting with Russ under center. And this looks like the old Arthur Smith Tennessee offense, where he had Ryan Tannehill and Derrick Henry and A.J. Brown, and really revived Ryan Tannehill's career. And obviously, George Pickens is, 80%, 85% of A.J. Brown, and Najee Harris is like 60% of Derrick Henry. But this is still an offense that is capable of doing well. They put up 37 points against the Jets. The 49ers are the only other team that's put up more than 25 points against the Jets. They put up 26 points against the Giants, a team that hasn't allowed anyone to go for over 28 points. And then Washington's defense has looked good against a bunch of mediocre and subpar competition. The Cardinals are the only average to above average offense that they did well against. They got smashed by Tampa, Cincy, and Baltimore. Now, those are all really good offenses, but the Steelers have kind of looked like a really good offense with Russell Wilson under center. And so this is a spot where, you could paint the picture of Pittsburgh being a spot to go to. And then you have the Jets, who Rodgers, he's going to run his offense, and his offense is sort of an outdated offense. There's very little play action. There's very little motion, right? And we know that those are 2 cheat codes to getting guys open. Rodgers isn't as worried about that, because what he likes to do is read the field, know what the defense is doing, and throw a perfect throw to somebody that he has a good connection with in the short areas of the field, and just continue picking up first downs. And so Rodgers doesn't care that the play action isn't there to help him. Rodgers doesn't care that the motion's not there to help him, because he doesn't want those things. What he wants is to be able to see the field and not have to turn his back to the defense and throw it to his guy, who is creating just enough separation for Rodgers to get the ball in there. So this is why we don't see Rodgers go for big games himself all that often. But why are the Jets interesting? Because they're a pretty concentrated passing attack. And so, with this concentrated passing attack, and, Mike Williams gone, Allen Lazard out, it's going to be Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams. That's who are going to be the focal points in this spot. And so Xavier Gibson may be interesting as a guy filling in out of the slot. Maybe it's Malachi Corley who ends up being interesting, but most of the targets are going to flow to Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams, so that makes them interesting in the spot. And then we have San Francisco and Tampa. So we'll save the deeper dive for San Fran and Tampa for the DFS interpretations for the player grid. But another spot where, Tampa, they're probably not calling a ton of design plays for their wide receivers, but their wide receivers are cheap. They're going to see 5 targets. Maybe one of them gets 6, 7 targets. And so there's opportunity for a big score to emerge there. And then the 49ers, I guess we'll touch on it briefly here, but basically the initial thought when you look at this slate is you kind of look at this slate and it's like, there's really not a lot to love. And then like Brock Purdy against Tampa. Like Tampa's been getting destroyed by passing attacks. This is pretty obvious, right? So Brock Purdy is obviously going to be popular. Kind of interesting to note, and I didn't expect, I went into my DFS interpretation right up for this game, expecting to just, fall more deeply in love with the idea of playing Brock Purdy. The Bucs are not a bad pass defense. They're not good. They're not bad. The issue for the Bucs has been they face so much volume because Tampa is aggressive on offense and they score points and they kind of keep the foot on the gas and force opponents to be aggressive when they have the ball. And then teams are still, even though the Tampa run defense is not what it used to be, teams are still avoiding the run against Tampa. And so the Bucs are facing, one of the highest pass play rates in the NFL, among the highest pass attempts per game in the NFL. And that's what's really leading to these big games. It's a mediocre pass defense facing tons of volume. It's actually very similar to what they had back in the Jameis Winston, Ryan Fitzpatrick year, where it was like you could not run the ball against Tampa, and everybody perceived the Tampa pass defense as being awful. The truth was they were average, but they faced a ton of volume. And so this is a spot where people kind of might copy and paste the production of other quarterbacks onto Brock Purdy and be like, man, quarterbacks are consistently having their best game of the season against the Bucs. Like Brock Purdy is just such a clear and obvious play, but the 49ers have 16 regular season wins since the start of last year. Do you think the 49ers are going to win this game against a depleted Tampa team, right? They have 16 regular season wins since the start of last year. Brock Purdy has topped 30 pass attempts in one of those 16 games. So 15 out of 16 wins, he's been at 30 or fewer pass attempts. And so the 49ers team that can run on anybody that's typically willing to still lean on the run game, that's getting Christian McCaffrey back this week, that's typically willing to lean on the run game, even in matchups that don't necessarily set up well for that, there's a pretty good chance that Brock Purdy the 49ers win this game. Brock Purdy still throws the ball 26 to 30 times. And Brock Purdy, you can look through his game logs. Yes, he can put up 22, 24, 26 DraftKings points on 26 to 30 pass attempts. But he's probably not any likelier to do that in this spot than in most other spots. Whereas the field is going to look at this as a spot and be like, man, like obvious smash spot for Brock Purdy without kind of digging in a little bit deeper and understanding why teams are doing so well against Tampa through the air in terms of fantasy production and without realizing that that's not really how the 49ers attack games. And so it will not surprise me if Purdy puts up 24, 25, 26 DraftKings points, but it also won't surprise me if he does it on only 26 to 30 pass attempts. In fact, I'll be very surprised if it's more pass attempts than that. And since I expect him to throw 26 to 30 times, it also won't surprise me if this ends up being like a 16, 17, 18-point game for Brock Purdy. And again, volume, it's not like this is just some smash matchup for the wide receivers. It's that the volume piles up for wide receivers for most offenses against Tampa. And if that doesn't end up being the case, then you just have Debo and Pearsall and Juwan Jennings in this spot where they're seeing their normal volume against kind of an average defense. So can one of them hit? Yes, but is it as likely as it's going to look when people just look, man, San Francisco against Tampa? No, not at all. So that's all the wide receivers, like wide receiver groups on this slate. And going through that, you can kind of see why nothing really stands out all that much. So we know even when things don't stand out, ownership is going to congregate regardless. So these are early ownership projections. This is largely algorithm driven based off of projection systems, based off of what optimizers are spitting out at this early point in the week. But this often ends up being pretty close to what we end up seeing deeper into the week. So let's go ahead and touch on this. So I'm going to touch on a few quarterbacks, 2 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 4 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. And I'm going to just touch on some of now again, every single one of these plays was on my list when not every single one of them, almost all of these plays were on my list when I just finished my research and pulled my list, right? But I'm going to touch on why these are not high confidence plays, right? So it's chalk, and it's not bad chalk. It is sharp chalk in the context of this week, but it's not chalk that you have to think, I probably can't win a tournament without it. Now, some of it's going to hit, some of it's going to miss, but the chances of lots of this chalk hitting at had to have it levels are low. The chances of you coming out of the weekend and being like, man, I should have just pulled 3 or 4 players from the most popular players on the slate because all of them smashed, that's pretty low, right? So let's go through and basically hit on why I'm not expressing as much confidence in these players on my own end as we're seeing ownership express. So Brock Purdy, we already touched on that. The passing volume in the Tampa matchup won't be surprising if he goes for 24, 26 DraftKings points, but that would be because he's really good and the matchup is middling and the 49ers can smash in a spot like that. It's not because Tampa's so bad against the pass, because again, I just don't see Purdy's passing volume spiking the way that it does for other teams. That's not really how the 49ers play. Herbert, currently projected for Purdy was 17.6% owned. Herbert, 12.6% owned. And this is 30% of the tournament field right now is Purdy or Herbert. Herbert, again, probably get, around 30 pass attempts if the Chargers continue to let him throw the ball the way they have the last couple of weeks in games they have controlled, which I think they will. But 30 pass attempts, because we probably don't see Tennessee pushing the scoring pace in this game. So 30 pass attempts against a good defense. Yeah, I mean, I think he puts up, I'll save kind of deeper thoughts for him for the player grid, but I think he has a high floor, basically. The question is, how high is his ceiling? The question is, can he put up a score that you couldn't win without? He probably needs either just to get something fluky happens, or game environment to cooperate in order to put up a score that you couldn't win without. Aaron Jones, currently 33.1% projected ownership. Now, Saquon just smashed against the Jags, but we know that the Jags are decent against the run and horrible against the pass. We know that the Vikings, even though they're not passing the ball a ton in terms of volume, they're still one of the higher pass rate over expectation teams in the NFL. And Aaron Jones has only one game on the season of more than 20.6 DraftKings points. This guy costs 6.7K in salary. So 20.1 points is 3x his salary. 20.1 points keeps you on a 150-point pace. He's only topped 20.6 points once all year. So Aaron Jones, there's some additional components there. He's had bad touchdown luck. He has a pretty sizable red zone role. So there's certainly opportunity for him to post a big game, right? I'm not saying he can't. What I'm saying is, and again, he was one of the guys I isolated. I was like, oh, Aaron Jones, this is an interesting week for Aaron Jones. But then you look and you're like 33% owned, right? Like in the context of a typical slate, Aaron Jones should probably be 8 to 12% owned if there was enough other things to like. Instead, he's 33% owned. So just keep that in mind. Alvin Kamara, so he had 35 touches last week. Jamal Williams was out. Kennedy Miller was placed on IR by Dennis Allen. Kind of a wild situation there, where he didn't need to be on IR. We know Dennis Allen did not like Kennedy Miller. Surprised Kennedy Miller with a trip to IR because he was tired of Kennedy Miller being hurt, and then he lost his job. Anyhow, Jamal Williams will be back this week. Alvin Kamara, I mean, just to highlight, right? They've got a big investment in this player. He's an aging player. He's dealing with broken ribs and a broken hand. And they just gave him 35 touches. They're out of the playoff hunt, right? His previous touch counts heading into last week, previous 4 games, 16, 13, 18, and 17. Do we want to pay his high price tag at 30% ownership if he's getting 13 to 18 touches? No, not at all. Absolutely not. Now, could he see 30 plus touches again? Yes. But again, just poking holes and saying like the confidence that's being expressed in this play by the field is different from like the confidence we should have in this play. He has potential to be a had to have it piece, but also there's downside to this that the field is not really accounting for in this ownership exposure. Breece Hall, 20.1% expected ownership. Okay, so he has one game in the last 4 where his snap share was down. And that was a game where they played the Patriots. The Patriots had just been smashed on the ground by Tank Bigsby. Braylon Allen has a very similar body type and running style to Tank Bigsby. And so Braylon Allen stepped back in kind of for this timeshare that he had earlier in the season. But since Todd Downing took over the play calling, 3 out of 4 games, Breece Hall has been at 77% or more of the snaps. But even with that, his last 3 games, his touch counts are 17, 17, and 18. For a guy who's expensive and projected to be 20.1% owned, I mean, you can really poke holes in that. So limited volume now. He can also see 23 touches, 24 touches. But again, just things to consider here. And then James Conner, 20% projected ownership. Best game all year was 22.4 DraftKings points. He's playing against the Jets defense. So again, can he hit? Yes. Is there a potential that 20 points from a 6.5K running back is actually proves to be really valuable on this week? Yes, but just poking some holes there, some things to think about. Then wide receiver, we have Deebo Samuel, projected for 21.3% ownership. This kind of carries off of the Purdy like layer one thoughts. You're going to look and be like, man, Purdy smash spot against Tampa without necessarily going layer two. Pretty quietly, Deebo has failed to top 23.7 DraftKings points in 31 of his last 35 regular season games. Now, he put up a couple 37 pointers last year, so the ceiling is there, but just recognize like most of the time, like an overwhelming majority of the time, he is going to put up, his kind of low score or his teens score or his low 20s score for a popular guy who's expensive. Ladd McConkey, he's one who was not on my list. He has a short area role with recent target counts of 7.6, 7.8, So chances of him posting a game at his elevated price tag that you had to have in order to win are obviously low. Josh Downs, 19.2%. He's one of the guys who I was like, man, I might really like Josh Downs this week because of how thin this week is. And then you're also like, I don't want to pay 6.2K for him against Buffalo, but I might have to do that this week. And then you look and he's 19.2% projected owned. And that's before the Michael Pittman news has been accounted for. Michael Pittman going to miss this week. So again, another one where it's like, yeah, I like the play. I don't like the ownership on it. That might not dissuade me on Josh Downs because wide receiver is so thin this week. But just again, things to think about, things to account for. Drake London, 16.9% projected ownership. Again, obviously another guy who was not on my list when I came out of my research. But are the Saints going to push the scoring pace in such a way that volume piles up for Drake London? Ask that question and then answer whether or not you want to play him at 16.9% projected ownership. Tight end Will Dissly, 21% projected ownership. Okay. I mean, oh, sure. And then Taysom Hill, right? We were on Taysom Hill last week. I'll probably be on Taysom Hill again this week, but 13.7% projected ownership for Taysom Hill just kind of reveals the state of things this week. That a guy like Taysom Hill, who people always avoid, we can actually end up in a situation, because it's like, I can't predict his role. I don't know when he's going to have his big game. And yet people are like, I don't know, there's nothing to like this week. Throw Taysom Hill on there, right? 13.7% projected ownership just reveals the state of things. All right, so then some plays lower down. I'm just thinking about, can this guy end up providing a path to a tournament win? Mac Jones, 0.4% projected ownership. He's 4,400. So what are we saying there? What we're saying there is maybe Herbert scores 17 and maybe Sam Darnold at 6,200, another popular guy, scores 18 to 22. And maybe Brock Purdy, another 6,500, another expensive, middle expensive popular guy. Maybe he ends up scoring 18 to 22. Maybe Hurts, who is not throwing the ball, right? We're just relying on touchdowns from him. And Josh Allen, who is often having the ball taken out of his hands, maybe they both score around 20 to 24, which has been very common for both guys this year. And maybe Mac Jones scores 20, 22, right? Mac Jones obviously got completely broken the last couple of years, but his rookie year, he won Rookie of the Year. He was a Pro Bowler, led the Patriots to the playoffs as a rookie quarterback. Like there were good things building for Mac Jones. His confidence got broken. That offense got broken. The team lost buy-in. They didn't have wide receivers to throw to. They didn't have an offensive line. Could he come out and play well enough here to put up, again, not a great matchup against his Minnesota defense, but could he play well enough here to put up 20-ish points, 22 points? And then maybe Parker Washington is the stacking partner that you need with him. And now all of a sudden you're paying $8K and maybe you're getting 40 points for $8K. And you've materially changed the salary structure of your roster compared to what other people are going to be doing, which allows the rest of your roster to look different. Talking about combinatorial ownership, right? You can then put together you can put together a Garrett Wilson and a Saquon Barkley, maybe another expensive guy that like the field is just not on combinatorially, that the field will not find a way to be able to play these two or three guys together. And this would give you the opportunity to do something like that. Drake May consistently is finding a way to put up fantasy points because he's consistently taking off and putting up points on the ground. He is consistently letting go of the desire to sort of work the shorter areas of the field. As games start to get away from the Patriots, he switches over to like, screw it, let's take some shots downfield type modes. That can lead to interceptions, but it can also lead to big plays. So Drake May, 1% projected ownership. Is there a pathway to Drake May? Now, this is not the spot for it to happen, right? But Drake May could have a Josh Allen rookie year arc where people were so bought into the idea that Josh Allen was a bust, that he'd been overdrafted, and that the Bills had no weapons around him, that they stopped paying attention to him. And when he closed out the year starting to put up 30-point scores, people still were not paying attention to him. And we started watching those games and realizing, oh, this is actually pretty interesting. Josh Allen's a pretty interesting player, and just hammering Josh Allen week in and week out through the last, whatever it was, 5 or 6 weeks of that season, of that 2018 season. Drake May has that arc in his range of outcomes. So this is not the spot where we're likeliest to see it happen, but Drake May is certainly an interesting guy to think about on a week like this where you're like, man, maybe nothing really stands out. Drake May is a guy capable of putting up a 30-point score, and it won't be surprised if he has 1 or 2 of those down the stretch during the season. Again, not the best matchup for it, but on a week like this, you might overlook the matchup and think about something like that. Saquon Barkley, 7.4% projected ownership. Don't even ask me about this one. Mentioned this in DFS interpretations in the player grid. Take all the flex players on the slate, all the running backs, all the wide receivers, all the tight ends available on the main slate. Among all of them, there have been 6 times this year where a 36-point score has been produced. Saquon has 3 of those. So he has half of the 36-plus point scores from all the players on this week's slate. And now he's playing the Cowboys defense that's one of the 2 worst run defenses in football on this team that's emphasizing the ground game. So Saquon, 7.4% projected ownership. Could that end up being something that separates you from the field? James Cook, 4.6 projected ownership. Why? Because when he misses, he puts up like 10 points, right? And he's pretty expensive for a guy who might only get you 10 points, but also he has 2 games of 28 plus. And so on a week like this, where the field might be expressing way too much certainty and gravitating toward guys who are scoring in the high teens, in the low 20s, if Cook puts up 28, 30, 33 points, all of a sudden at low ownership, he's really separating from the field. Then we have Ramondre Stevenson, high-low, isolated and highlighted this last week. In competitive games, Ramondre Stevenson has DraftKings points of 5 competitive games for the Patriots. In those 5 games, Ramondre, 24.6, 17, 19.2, 23.5, 22.4. When the Patriots play things close, Ramondre Stevenson is a guy who can put up big games. Again, Andrew Billings out for the Bears. That's the way to attack the Bears, is on the ground. I think that the Patriots can keep this game close. And so if they're able to, Ramondre Stevenson, 4.4% projected ownership becomes really interesting. Wide receiver, Trey Palmer, 3.9% projected ownership. So, what was it, 2 weeks ago? Everyone was all in on the Bucs wide receivers. Now everybody's off the Bucs wide receivers. Like, Trey Palmer is still on the field. He still has opportunities. This is just kind of like in that cheap with upside bucket, but he still has opportunities to hit for some big plays. At 3.9% projected ownership, potential to be a separator on this slate. Rome Odunze, a guy who nobody's going to want to play because most of the time he's going to put up 6 points, 7 points, 8 points. And again, we don't expect heavy passing volume from the Bears, but this is the type of week. This is the type of week where you could say, yeah, but Rome Odunze can score 25 on 8 targets. And if he does that at 3.2% predicted ownership, that's massive for you if you're rostering him. So another guy that we can, there's more than just these guys, but I wanted to specifically highlight guys at the bottom of ownership projections who you could look at and be like, man, this guy actually has a pretty high ceiling. Or his chance of getting there as high as the popular guys? No, but the ceiling is probably higher. And if they hit, that ends up making a massive difference in tournaments, especially on a week like this where we probably won't get a ton of high-end scores. The guys who do hit, especially if they do it at low ownership, can be major difference makers. And then Parker Washington, currently projected for 2.3% ownership, as the guy in the Christian Kirk role for the Jags. Ideally, Gabe Davis comes back because that would kick Parker Washington back into the slot where he's best. He played on the outside last week, and Austin Trammell played in the slot for Jacksonville. But Parker Washington, another interesting play this week. And then Amari Cooper, if he gets over this wrist thing, right? No Keon Coleman. Amari Cooper projected for 1.3% ownership against a bad defense in Indianapolis. What? Like, Amari Cooper's ceiling is so high, right? So 1.3% projected ownership, another one to consider. TJ Hawkinson played 33 snaps last week. Maybe he gets up to 50 snaps this week. 3.2% projected ownership at a thin position. Cole Kmet, similar to the Rome Odunze thing, right? Cole Kmet has one game on a couple like 24, 25 point DraftKings scores this year. One was on heavy volume, and one was just a 2-touchdown game, right? And the rest of the time he's putting up bad scores. But the fact that he's capable of putting up these 2-touchdown games, we saw it with Fields in the past. We've seen it once with Caleb Williams, another guy who people just won't be on. but actually has potential to put up that separator type of score this week. So that's not all the players on this slate who are capable of putting up separator types of scores, but those are some players at the bottom of the projected ownership pool that I just wanted to isolate and highlight to continue down this path. What we're talking about, the picture on the puzzle box this week of like, yeah, these plays that are most popular are the best plays, but on most weeks they wouldn't be the best plays. And there's some unpopular plays that have the ceiling to jump over those plays, just the way that we should be thinking about this slate this week. Okay. With that, let's move to the bottom-up build. Bottom-up build, we kind of teased this setup a little bit. If you're unfamiliar with the bottom-up build, we build with a 44K salary cap. If you want to build with a 44K salary cap, you can join the bottom-up build contest. It's free. There's real prizes, free stuff on OWS, $150 worth of free stuff on OWS to first place, $100 to second, $50 to third, and it's free to enter. It's a good thought exercise. Build from the bottom up, 44K salary cap. Okay, so I wanted to get Saquon Barkley on this roster. Again, it's not really this year where we're not seeing 200-point scores on the 50K salary cap build on the main slate, but in the past, we've had lots of times where we see 200-point scores from our bottom-up build winner, spending 44K in salary cap. Well, how do they do that? They're finding cheap guys who are capable of putting up 20 or 30, probably won't get there, but they have that outside shot at putting up 20 or 30. And then they're getting the expensive guy who has the highest ceiling on the slate. So if things come together, if Saquon Barkley puts up his 36-pointer and some of our cheap plays put up 15 to 20, all of a sudden we're way ahead of everybody else in a contest like this. And then we realize that sort of trains our thinking to realize that's oftentimes a way to build in tournaments, especially as we get deeper into the season. This point in the season where salary savers does become pretty thin. And so a lot of times it's about just saying, okay, who can hit for a big game? Because if I land that 20-pointer from a cheap guy, I'm in tremendous shape. So we have too many of those guys on this roster because we're trying to fit up Saquon Barkley on a 44K salary cap roster, but that allows us to kind of isolate and highlight that thought process and that type of thinking and realize that's one of the things we want to be thinking about on a week like this deep into the season. So we start out with Saquon Barkley and the stack of Russell Wilson, Najee Harris, and I wanted to do George Pickens, but that wouldn't allow me to get Saquon. So what we're going to do here is Calvin Austin. Calvin Austin, 2 games already this year of 20-plus DraftKings points, very much falls into that bucket of guys who are on the field all the time, capable of scoring from anywhere on the field, won't see more than 3 to 5 targets almost every single week, and yet is going to have, the 2, 3, 4 games a year where they end up putting up 20 points. And on a week like this, where there's no clear value, there's no value that you're like, oh, this guy's really sharp toward 20 plus points. Well, then you can take a guy like Calvin Austin and say, man, there's a good chance that if he scores 20, he's the only guy 4K and below topping 13 DraftKings points. So then you're separating massively from the field. So we went with the Russell Wilson, Najee Harris, Calvin Austin stack. And again, this is not one that stands out on paper, but it's saying, where can we move away from what stands out on paper to potentially target some ceiling that the field will not be targeting? So starts out Russell Wilson, Saquon Barkley, Najee Harris, Calvin Austin. We're going to bring it back with Noah Brown. Again, I've highlighted these guys are not on Washington, not hitting 4x their salary. But Noah Brown's only 4.3K, and there could be a ton of players on this slate who don't go for, like there could be very few players on the slate who actually go for 4x their salary. And Noah Brown, even though he hasn't done it yet, he's seeing enough targets to be capable of doing it with his skill set. He's seeing pretty bankably like 6 targets a game. And that's enough for Noah Brown to hit for a big game, kind of like, Calvin Austin type thing, where Noah Brown can hit for a big game. And even when he's not hitting for a big game, he's going to get you hopefully 7 points, 8 points, 11 points, 12 points. So at 4.3K, nice bring back on this build. Raheem Jarrett led the Bucs wide receivers in snaps last week. Last year had an average depth of target over 17. This year on his 4 targets, he has an average depth of target of 14. So again, this is the guy that they're using downfield. He's kind of stepped into this Mike Evans role, even though he's a different build, different type of player than Mike Evans. He's still the downfield threat for this Bucs offense. And so Raheem Jarrett becomes somewhat central to what the Bucs will need to be able to get going in order to win this game against the 49ers. And so Raheem Jarrett at 3,300 is just a really nice way to save some salary, get some upside. We're going to throw the Bears defense on here, 3K. We're going to throw Hunter Henry on here, a guy who I think is 9, 8, and 5 targets in his 3 games with Drake May. So at 3,900, just kind of a screaming value there. And then we're going to throw Jordan Addison on here. Jordan Addison in the same bucket as Rome Odunze, where it's like, yeah, the research doesn't point to this guy but this guy's capable of putting up a 25 to 30 point score. And if we're able to land that and people are not on it, that ends up giving us a big edge this week. So altogether, that gives us Russell Wilson at quarterback, paired with Najee Harris and Calvin Austin. Saquon Barkley is our other running back. Noah Brown is our bring back on that Steelers stack. Raheem Jarrett, Hunter Henry, Jordan Addison, and the Bears defense rounds us out. Exactly 44K in salary spent. And with that, I am going to get out of here. I appreciate you guys hanging out. Hopefully this gave you a good idea, a good sense of what this slate shapes up like and some of the unique ways we might want to be thinking about attacking this particular slate. So with that, I'll get out of here, and I will see you on 1 week season throughout the weekend. I will see you in my player grid on Sunday morning with my update, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.